What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to the channel. Now, if you didn't see last week's video, this week's video is a bit of a, I don't know what you want to call it, a little bit of a lower effort product. I apologize that it's not at the standard quality that I normally try to aim for on these channels. However, the short of it is that I went on a cruise a couple of weeks ago, got back from it, got a cold, and didn't feel like, felt like crap. So I didn't get where I expected to be going as fast as I expected to do that. And as a result, I needed a couple of days, well, a week of recovery, essentially. And well, the short of it is that I'm trying to play catch up to get some padding down so that I can get back to the regular scheduled project working speed. That said, this video is going to be talking about that cruise. Editor me interjecting here just for a second. I should make some context clear on all this. I traveled with Norwegian Cruise Line, or NCL, aboard the Norwegian Sun. All of the cruises that I have done to Alaska have been with Norwegian Cruise Line, so if you are traveling on a different cruise line, some things may be different. For example, I think the Ward Cove Cruise Terminal in Ketchikan may be owned or only used by NCL. I'm not 100% sure on that, so you may not see that on your itinerary if you're on another ship or another cruise line. Also, I do talk about things like getting left behind or whatever a little bit. Now, I know with NCL, they have a policy in place that if you are on an excursion that is organized or purchased through NCL, through your ship, through your cruise, and something happens that excursion doesn't return on time, they're not supposed to leave you behind. The excursions are supposed to work out stuff to make sure that you get back as long as you are on an excursion purchased through your ship or through the cruise line. I don't know if that's the case with other lines. I would hope it would be, but it may not be. So there's just to avoid some confusion on some of the comments that I make further on in this video. So if you saw my video that I posted a couple of months ago where I talked about the gear I was taking on the cruise, then, well, this is kind of the summary of that. Now, I had no intention of making this video when I went or when I was going, and I didn't actually intend to make it when I came back. So I do not have an awful lot of great B-roll or specific shots and whatnot from the cruise to sort of edit in. So you're going to have to deal with just kind of me talking. Now, I do have my usual time lapse that I shoot when I'm on one of these kinds of cruises that I will throw up as much as I can to have something for you to look at. Before I get into the discussion, I do want to say that I'm kind of breaking this into two parts. One part is for cruise notes and one part is for gear notes. I have them time-stamped and bookmarked or chapter marked in the description. So if you don't want to see the cruise notes or the gear notes, just skip to the part that you do want to see. Otherwise, carry on all the way through. Now, I want to start with the cruise notes on this, and I want to start with just a point that the weather absolutely sucked on this trip. This was the worst trip that I have been on weather-wise. It was gray, overcast, and raining the entire time we were there. I think the sun came out 2, maybe 3 times for a couple of hours, and it went back to raining. I have no talent at painting, and I could paint the landscape that we had. You just need to give me gray, and that's about what there was to shooting. Or to the landscape and scenery. Now, a consequence of that is that I have basically no photos from this trip to talk about, and I shot very little on this trip to talk about, which turns out means that I could have taken nothing and it would have been perfectly fine. But from a functional perspective, it does mean that I can't really provide any feedback on how my gear choices affected things other than, well, I know that that was a perfectly acceptable thing to pack because I have taken that or something very similar to that setup on previous cruises that I had better luck with the weather in. So weather was a running problem on this trip. Now, if you haven't been to Alaska, you should go. It's really good, and don't let bad weather scare you off. That, barring the fact that it caused a couple of excursions that I was booked on to be canceled and obviously made the photography less than stellar, it was still a great trip. However, this was my fourth cruise, and the last time I was up there was in 2019, and about the only thing that I can say in 4 years, from fall of 2019 to spring of 2024, so not even 4 years, 3.5 years, is that so much has changed up there. I don't know if I want to say for the better or for the worse, because as with almost everything, there are certainly pros and cons to either end of that discussion. There are obviously pros for the locals, the local economy, etc. There's also cons for the locals, the local economy, etc., as well as pros and cons for you as a cruise ship passenger. So I wanted to touch on a couple of these points, starting with Icy Strait Point. Icy Strait Point is the cruise facility outside of the town of Juneau, Alaska. It's right on the Icy Straits. It's right next to Glacier Bay. It's largely, you could say, insularly a cruise destination. It's not a private cruise resort or private island or anything like that. It's used by basically, as far as I know, all the cruise lines use it or show up there. But it is a area targeted towards cruise lines. Now, back in 2019, they had completed a new dock. So the first time I was up in Alaska in 2015, the only way you could get to Icy Strait Point was to tender in. The ships would lower off some of their lifeboats, which are also actually tenders, set up a dock on the side of the ship. You'd get in a lifeboat / tender. It would take you to shore. And honestly, that's kind of a cool experience. I know a lot of people complained and moaned on this trip specifically that they had to do this. I think it's kind of a neat sort of, this is how things used to be done in Alaska almost everywhere or in many places, and it's not really the way that it happens anymore kind of experience. I really enjoyed it. Now, the reason that we did have to tender in is that there were 2 ships tied up on the piers there. So there is a new pier in Icy Strait Point. There are 2 of them. If you are going ashore, you need to be aware of this because one of them is directly off of the old cannery that's sort of the core of the Icy Strait Point area. The other one is away from that, and you have to take an aerial tram or a fairly good walk on a path to get to it from the core area and vice versa. So in our situation, we actually showed up. There were 2 other NCL ships there. I think it was the Jewel and the Bliss that were tied up. The Bliss was scheduled to leave like an hour after we got there. So by the time I got ashore, because I had a very early excursion there relative to our port call, by the time I got ashore, the ship I was on, which was the Norwegian Sun, moved over and took one of the piers and was tied up. And so you could just walk on and off like you normally would in most other ports. That said, like I said, I thought it took me back. I thought it was really enjoyable going through the little tendering process to get ashore there, as much as everybody else was complaining and moaning about the process, etc. I thought it was a neat throwback. The second port I want to talk about is Ketchikan. So our cruise, 9 days, we did, and I'm not going to get these in order, but Icy Strait Point, Sitka, Skagway, Glacier Bay, Juneau, Ketchikan, Victoria, British Columbia. I'm not talking about all of these. Some of the places really haven't changed that much. Juneau was Juneau. Sitka, I didn't notice any difference between Sitka this time and Sitka the time that I was there the last couple of times I've been there. Ketchikan has changed. I don't know if this applies to other cruise lines or just NCL, but you may find on your itinerary that it says Ketchikan Ward Cove instead of Ketchikan proper. Now, all of the previous 3 cruises that I have done that have gone to Ketchikan have docked or tied up in downtown Ketchikan. And that's where I assumed we would be tying up this time, even though our itinerary said Ward Cove. In fact, Ward Cove is not in downtown Ketchikan. This is, as far as I can tell, a new or new-ish, I don't know exactly when they started operating out of it, cruise pier / terminal in the Ketchikan area. And it is about a 20-minute ride from downtown Ketchikan. Now, if you have excursions booked through the cruise line, they all depart from the terminal at Ward Cove. You don't have to worry about like getting a bus into town or anything like that. So from the perspective of, maybe the average cruise person who's like, I booked an excursion through my cruise line and I just go do that and get back on the boat and have lunch or whatever. It does not matter that much whether they tie up or whether your ship ties up in Ketchikan proper or in Ward Cove. There is a big souvenir gift shop restaurant thing that is at the end of the pier, and they have a crab restaurant there too, and all the normal kind of stuff. But on the flip side, if you are the kind of person who is either doing a third-party excursion, I don't know how that works exactly there because I didn't do one, or you just want to go walk around downtown in the historic area of Ketchikan and whatnot, then you're going to need to plan for around a 20-minute, I believe there is a shuttle that runs from Ward Cove to downtown Ketchikan. They don't like completely isolate you, but it's not a walkable, at least it's not a reasonably walkable thing. It is a 20-minute ride to get down there. And so you're going to need to plan on that. And you're going to need to plan on leaving early enough to get back to your ship with that shuttle. And depending on how busy the shuttles end up being at the end, you will have to take consideration of that. On that note, one other thing to consider is our driver, when we were going out to an excursion from Ward Cove, was talking about the fact that the road from Ward Cove to Ketchikan had been blocked the previous season or something because of an accident. And because, for example, the excursion that I was doing, it was a UTV drive to Lake Mahoney, Mahoney Lake, whatever they call it, however you put it. Because that was booked through the cruise ships, and the cruise ships, at least with NCL, the cruise line guarantees or works to guarantee that if you're on an excursion booked through them, they won't leave you at the port, which is not a guarantee that is made if you are booking third-party excursions or if you just decide to go ashore and do whatever. The driver was talking about how the company that he worked for actually had to charter a boat to take people back to the cruise ship from downtown because of that accident. So that is something to keep in mind if your ship is tying up at Ward Cove and you decide you want to either third party it or excursion it, or you want to just go downtown. I don't know how rare it is it sounds like it was a pretty rare thing for an accident that big. But it is something to sort of keep in mind in that risk thought process, however you want to put it, that you are not in downtown, and it is not a short walk from downtown, the historic Ketchikan downtown district to Ward Cove in the event of what's going on or that kind of thing. So if you are going to do something like that, I would make sure that you have contact information in your phone for the cruise line, the cruise ship, one of those things, or obviously if you have a smartphone, you should have internet access, hopefully. But that is something to keep in mind. Now, the last port I want to talk about is Skagway. Now, as I said, I also went to Sitka and Juneau. I didn't notice anything different in either of those two ports compared to previous trips. In Sitka, the cruise ships, or at least Norwegian's cruise ships, the ones I've been on, tie up about a 10 or 15 minute ride outside of town. That there's a shuttle that runs, and they do the same kind of thing as what I just talked about at Ward Cove. There's souvenirs, there's food, there's stuff going on, and all of the cruise-oriented or cruise ship excursions leave from where the cruise ship ties up. There's also a free shuttle that takes people into downtown Sitka. Again, it's a single road, as far as I know, from the cruise terminal to downtown Sitka. It's a 15 or so minute, maybe 20 minute at the most, ride in and out, so you need to plan accordingly. Juneau, same kind of deal, at least NCL. Every ship that I've been on with NCL ties up at the southernmost, essentially, pier in Juneau. There's a shuttle that takes you like 5 minutes into downtown. You can also walk this one. It is not, I've not walked it, but it is not a really long walk. I think, like I said, it's a 5 or 6 minute shuttle ride. It's a maybe 15-minute walk in the worst case scenario. Otherwise, this is similar in some respects to what I was just talking about. All of the cruise line booked excursions leave from the end of the pier, so you don't have to like get a ride into town. But for third-party excursions, you do have to deal with that. The last port I want to talk about was Skagway, and lots have changed. Things have changed at Skagway. So our ship tied up at the railroad pier. The railroad pier is the southernmost pier in the area in Skagway. I don't remember what the other two are, but there's like 2 piers or 3 piers the total that the cruise ships can tie up at. The railroad pier can take 2 ships. The Norwegian Jewel, I think, was tied up ahead of us on the pier at the time. Stuff has changed there. If you've been to Skagway in the past, there was in, I want to say 2017, a landslide that came down from the mountain next to the railway pier, or the railroad pier, and blocked part of the pier off, and has been a large issue ever since. You cannot walk from the cruise ship into town if you've tied up at the railroad pier. You might be able to from the berth that's further in, but from the outermost berth where our ship was tied up, is no walk. There are vans that run continuously that pick you up at the end of the pier and then drive you to the other end of the pier, essentially, but you have to ride that. It is what it is, I guess, is how I would say it. I personally not thrilled with that solution, especially when it backs up. When, for example, the White Pass and Yukon Railroad runs out of Skagway, and the train, when it lets out, backs up the vans significantly. So expect to end up waiting in line to get a van back to the cruise ship when your train, if you ride the train, lets out. Or if you happen to come back from another excursion when the train is dropping off passengers. This also means that there's been some changes to the White Pass and Yukon on this part of the trip. For starters, you no longer get on the train on the pier. The train doesn't run all the way down to the end of the pier, and therefore you have to ride. Like, it was a neat experience previously. The first trip that we were up there, you would get off the cruise ship onto the pier, and the train would literally be sitting there waiting for you to get on it. And that's not the case anymore. So that's a thing. Now, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, ownership of the White Pass and Yukon changed. Carnival is who owns it now. So it was purchased from the previous owner. It is now owned by Carnival the parent company for Carnival Cruises or whatever. This has led to some, again, changes. I hate to say good changes or bad changes because almost always changes have both sides of things. I was very disenchanted, disheartened to see a number of their historical GE narrow gauge engines. They're 50 plus years old, many of which have been repowered recently in the last several years with upgraded power and electronics and so forth. Basically sitting at the on a disconnected section of track or a blocked section of track on the pier, acting essentially as a barrier for landslides or rock falls. I fundamentally, I don't talk about it a lot in this channel, but if you've watched a number of my videos, trains show up a lot. I have been a rail fan. I don't know what you want to call it. I have liked trains been interested in trains since I was a little kid. And when it comes to historic railroads, historic short lines, that kind of thing, and historic equipment, I'm not a fan of taking stuff that is very much historic and doing the historic thing of throwing it in the river, so to speak. I know back 50, 60, 100 years ago, the White Pass and Yukon, even I don't remember when it was exactly, but took old obsolete steam engines and they threw them in the river because the river was washing out an area of track. And that was the easiest way to stabilize the bank. So I am going to talk about the railroad if it's not clear right now. For those of you who are not aware, the White Pass and Yukon is the most ridden 3-foot gauge tourist railroad in the United States. In fact, it might be the most ridden tourist railroad in North America. Of course, a lot of that has to do with the fact that it is a cruise port. The cruise port gets million-ish plus, I guess, it's something like that, visitors a year, and the easiest and most frequently done thing there is to load up a train on the White Pass and Yukon, ride it up to the top of the hill at White Pass Summit, turn around, and come back. It's like a 3-hour excursion, and like I said, originally they picked you up literally on the dock right outside of your cruise ship and dropped you off at the same place. Now it's a little bit more of a walk or a ride to get to where the train is, but it still picks you up like right at the dock and drops you off right at the dock as well. This has posed some problems in the past, and it has posed some problems with, for example, the historic engines that I was just talking about that have been sidelined to be rock catches. Namely, I think they're only 1,500 or were only 1,500 horsepower engines, and so they're not the most powerful thing to get a train up the hill. And of course, as cruise ships have gotten bigger, which I'm not convinced is a great thing for the passengers and the tourists and everything, that has put more stress on the railroad. More engines needed to pull, longer trains needed to pull all the passengers, more engines needed to pull the train. So there is some investment going on. Carnival Cruise parent company, whatever, has definitely been investing in the White Pass and Yukon. It has shown. It showed in 2019 when some of the changes had already started taking place. Definitely showed this time. But it also means that they're investing in things that look positive to me as a investment. So, for example, one of their historic steam engines was out for a test run. It has recently been overhauled, rebuilt, restored. I don't remember the exact details of it. It's the first time I've seen an operating steam engine on the White Pass when I was up there. It's not the first time they've had an operating steam engine on the railroad, mind you. But it was the first time I've seen one. And the fact that they're actually making that happen as a thing, I think is a good thing. The long and the short of it is steam power is much more interesting to look at than diesel power. And I would vastly prefer, if possible, to ride behind a steam engine than I would have to ride behind a diesel engine, especially on a railroad that's marketing itself as being this big historic thing. They've also continued to upgrade the track. So one of the big things that I noticed in 2019 when I rode is that there is a lot of continuously welded rail. If you're not familiar with railroad stuff, track is laid in essentially one of two ways. Historically, it was laid in 39 or 49 foot sections, depending on how long of a flat car you could have. Railroads often had shorter sections because they had shorter equipment. But 39 or 49 foot sections, and they were bolted together with joint bars in each piece, and those joints are what gives the train the most notable click-clack that you hear continuously as you're riding the train. Much more modern railroads have adopted a much more robust method of track laying, which is called continuously welded rail. And the short of it is those sections of rail are welded together into quarter-mile long sticks, and then the quarter-mile long sticks are often welded together in the field when they're laid. And basically, and if they're not, and on the White Pass, I don't think they did weld joints everywhere. Then you'd have joint bars every quarter mile instead of every 39 or 49 feet. This is, of course, much lower maintenance. It's much more stable. It's much better for the train. It actually provides a better ride because joint bars are a weak point, and therefore they tend to dip, and that tends to cause the track to or the cars to rock and roll a little more. So from a ride perspective, continuously welded rail is, definitely a step up. It does mean that the click-clack that you would be familiar with if you've ever ridden historic railroad or tourist railroad running on historic alignments is not there for a lot of the ride, which, good, bad, ugly, I don't know. That's one of those calls that are up to you. There are still significant places on the railroad that is jointed track. It's not all continuously welded rail, so there is still significant areas where you do get the click-clack. And because they jointed the connections between the continuous welded sections, there is click-clack still even there. It's just not as frequent. So that was kind of the start of it in 2019. In 2019, they had also installed the loop at White Pass Summit. And this is an operational expediency thing for the way things work. So the first time I rode back in 2015, you did what they called the White Pass Shuffle. And when the train got to the top of the hill, they would set the brakes, tie the train down, the engines would couple, run all around the train, couple onto the other end, and everybody in the train, the seat backs would flop over, and so everybody in the train would get up, flop their seat backs over so they pointed forward again, and then after all of that dancing and rigmarole, the train would depart from the top of the hill back to White Pass or to Skagway. And obviously that takes time. Uncoupling, recoupling, they have to do air tests because they've coupled the engines on and they need to make sure the air brakes are functioning and all of that kind of stuff. So the loop has reduced some of that time and overhead. So that is another aspect of an upgrade. And again, this is all for capacity, which means, like I said, it's different. I really have a hard time saying whether this is good or bad. It's basically different because they're obviously making the capacity upgrades because they need to make the capacity upgrades because the trains have gotten longer, the trains are fuller, there's more people on the trains, etc. And additionally, there were more areas where they had more passing sidings or double-tracked sections of track back in 2019. And that continues to appear to be what's going on. The very start of the trip outside of town, there's more continuous, or felt like there was more continuously welded rail than there was previously. Up at the top of the pass, it's still mostly all jointed. And it seemed like there was a lot more double track or extremely long passing sidings or passing loops for that area. So track upgrades are definitely happening as well. Which brings me to, I think, my biggest con about all of the upgrades, which is new engines. In the last couple of years, the White Pass and Yukon has purchased, I think it's 14 new diesel electric locomotives to pull the trains up the hill. They're, I believe, 3,000 horsepower or something to that effect. And they can basically, one of these ugly new engines, and I'm sorry, they're ugly, I don't like them, can pull a 14-car train, a loaded 14-car train up the hill. So, yeah. Because of that, I was not overly inclined to shoot much from photography spectrum of the trains because it wasn't the historical engines. Now, they have sold some of their historical engines. The Durango and Silverton has 2. I think the Cumbres and Toltec now has 1 or 2. So those are in Colorado and New Mexico. There was still a pile of the historical engines sitting in the yard in Skagway, in the engine shop, etc. I'm not sure what their plan is with all of them. I'm hoping that they don't just scrap the lot and replace it with the new engines. Now, that said, and I keep saying this, there are pros and cons to basically everything. I don't like the looks of the new engines, but the fact that the railroad's buying them and they needed them is a strong indicator that the railroad is doing well and they're not going away, which potentially means, at least from a rail fan, train enthusiast, whatever you want to call it, perspective, that as long as they keep some of the historic engines, there is always the option or opportunity for them to run them along with the steam engine for excursion trains, stuff that's more focused on being a historic excursion. Plus, from a passenger perspective, and again, this is a positive, these new engines appear to have dynamic brakes, which dynamic brakes are where the diesel locomotives' traction motors that power the wheels are run as generators, and then the current that is produced, or the power that's produced by the traction motors, is dissipated through a resistor as heat. And basically, the engine slows the train down without having to use the air brakes. Improves train handling. It was a more comfortable ride. We were on the last car of the train, or I was on the last car of the train when I was there. And the sort of thing you always notice on railroads that don't have the capability of running with dynamic brakes is they use air brakes. And you'll hear the air set, the cars will bunch, the slack will run in, it'll be a little bit of a jolt. Most railroads like this, because they're in the mountain, use retainers. So retainers keep the brakes from releasing immediately when the actual locomotive or engineer releases the air brake in the engine. So the engineer would get the train slowed down, they'd release the brakes. The brakes would slowly release over time, as it did the front end, because on a train, the front of the train's brakes will release before the rear of the train's brakes do. That would start to accelerate. The slack in the couplers would be pulled out. There'd be a little bit more of a jolt. The engineers did a really good job of train handling, period, in my experience on the railroad. But with the dynamic brakes, they could with the apparent capabilities of these new engines, they would set the dynamic brakes and the trains just glided down the hill. I don't remember there being any coupler change, any changes in slack or anything like that once we started down the hill from the train. And I know the engine, at least it sounded to me like it was running dynamic brakes. There was the whine of a fan. So that is definitely yielding a more comfortable ride for passengers. So again, like I said, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it, it depends on your perspective. I'm happy the railroad's still seemingly very profitable and still in business and still seems to be being able to make major investments in their future. And hopefully that means that at least some of the historic stuff gets preserved and run on excursions for people who are more interested in that historic side of things. Because the reality is most cruise ship passengers just don't care. They're riding the train up to the top of White Pass. They get on, they don't care what the engine, what kind of locomotive it is. They don't care that it's historic or modern. What they care is that the ride's smooth, the cars are comfortable, that they're not getting rained on, and they get to see the scenery. And the railroad is delivering that in spades for the vast majority of people that are there. And as long as they stay profitable, potentially can continue to deliver in much smaller, more focused operations, the historic stuff for the people who are really interested in that. So one final note on Alaska that I was reminded on this trip, and I haven't talked about because I don't really do cruise videos, is how slow getting around Alaska really is. So if you are trying to, riding an excursion, doing whatever, it's going to take a while from getting from the ship to wherever it is. In my experience, unless the excursion is something like a bus tour or something that starts right at the cruise terminal, figure you're going to have a 30 to 45 minute drive to and from the ship. That just seems to be like the case. So if you see an excursion that's advertising 3 hours, think of it as being an excursion that is going to be about an hour to an hour and a half of actual excursion, and an hour to an hour and a half of getting to and from it. So something to be aware of if you are trying to maximize your time. And with that said, I have realized that this has run far longer than I had intended to talk about Alaska stuff in general. So I'm going to end this video here, and I will talk about the gear in a separate video, probably that'll be coming next week. So if you are interested in the gear side of things for photography, consider checking that video out next week. So if you are new to the channel and you like this kind of thing, or this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. Of course, this is not my usual routine. Usually I am talking about camera gear and I am doing much more produced videos than these are, but I am trying to get some padding so that I can actually get those videos done and not rush them, which makes the content even worse. If you would like to directly support this channel and future videos like this, or like any of my other videos, or you found them useful and for you, please consider hitting that tip button or that thanks button if you can. Or if you can't do that and you're trying to buy yourself something you've always wanted and you happen to be buying it from one of our affiliates, please consider using one of our affiliate links in the description below to buy yourself that thing you've always wanted. That will give us a small commission, which helps make this channel continue to run. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.